This lecture is part of a program of intensive seminars in critical theory, which, through a grant from the Edward J. and Dorothy Clark Kempf Fund at Yale University, the Critical Theory Collective, can bring theorists for multiple seminars on their current work. We've had the luck over the past few days to think with Alenka Zupančič, to think through several logics that seem to me, the more I listen to her, vital for us. Yesterday, the logic of the real and the double. Today, the logic of sexual difference, as she has developed it, and tomorrow, the logic of apocalyptic thinking. I want to thank her for coming and sharing so patiently and openly her most meticulous, most expansive, and most rigorous dialectic. Alenka Zupančič is a researcher at the Slovene Academy of Sciences and Arts, a member of the Ljubljana School for Psychoanalysis, and a lecturer at the European Graduate School. She describes herself in a really singular way as a Lacanian philosopher and social theorist. The general nouns philosopher and theorist, singularized by adjectives Lacanian and social, but just as importantly, I think the adjectives are radically expanded by the nouns into a daring proposition. If Lacanian psychoanalysis could be a mode of philosophizing, it would become a theory of the social. This is, I think, the wager of Professor Zupančič's writing, which has crystallized into several important and well-known books. I will give the titles of the English translations, although some appeared in Slovenian and many have been translated into other languages as well. Starting in about 2000, we received, like gifts, The Ethics of the Real, Kant and Lacan, The Shortest Shadow, Nietzsche's Philosophy of the Two, Why Psychoanalysis, 3 interventions, The Odd One In on comedy, and most recently, What is Sex? Which sounds like a joke, but isn't. Some elements of which were under heavy discussion in the seminar today. The titles of her books should give you a sense of the risk that philosophy and psychoanalysis are thrown into in her work. Maybe no other Lacanian writes about Nietzsche. I heard her say this offhand yesterday. But you learn in reading her Nietzsche book that Nietzsche might be needed to make some of Lacan's insights about human subjectivity into ontological claims. This is directly, I think, her project, to take psychoanalysis beyond where it is sometimes comfortable, in the consultation room, the theory book, or the classroom, that is, in the realm of self-knowledge, as a tool for potentially better self-knowledge. She takes it with help from Nietzsche at one moment, now through sex, also not so long ago through comedy, to a principle of the way things are, an ontology. Our problem is not that we can only know ourselves through a glass darkly, so to speak, but that we are this glass, and everything we do is riven by its two sides, as is the social field. This thought is tremendously powerful for taking account of one experience, in particular, what Professor Zupančič calls ontological ambiguity. The sense that although you are called this and that, you do not identify completely with this or that. Indeed, you cannot, because your being, what you are, is split, doubled, and non-coincident with itself. You might say, how can I live this way? This is a joke. And yes, Zupančič is a fervent proponent of jokes, and she's also a great connoisseur. You'll probably hear some tonight. The books are full of them, and they seem to be a form of speech that is in solidarity with this split state. One terrific joke in the sex book goes, I don't know where it's from, she quoted it in seminar, quote, "There are no cannibals here. We ate the last one yesterday." Clearly, the cannibals are opaque to themselves. They don't know themselves well enough to see that their full bellies are exactly the sign of their cannibality. That's not a word. Zupančič uses this joke to illustrate something else, a very complex negation system in Lacanian logic. But it also illustrates or embodies the strange ontological given she's been working on for many years, that being a cannibal is precisely what you feel, this loss of identity and anxiety over your place, in the delay between having eaten your friend yesterday and maybe, perhaps, eating another one tomorrow. That might be why they, or we, need to eat another in the first place. This may not be the moment to invite you to the reception after the talk, but I do, and there will be one. If I've given you the smallest hint of the complexity and charm of these systematic and funny philosophical books, I will be glad. For more, I encourage those of you who haven't read them to read them. Tonight, Professor Zupančič will give a lecture entitled After the End of Art, Hegel with Francis Bacon. Let's welcome her.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you all for coming. And I really would like to stress how sincerely honored and happy I am to be able to be here this week to kind of share my theory, as you put it, with the group in the seminar, as well as here today this evening, and to emphasize that I really think how extraordinarily important the thing that you are doing with this critical theory initiative is. I think it's really one of the extremely important, also if you want, political acts in the times that we live in, and it has bearings, I think, much beyond the simple limits of the academic discussion. So really, thank you very much. Okay, my talk today will be mostly on Francis Bacon, not so much full of jokes, actually. Some pictures will be replacing them. I will talk on Bacon. I'm not, as you also said, I'm philosopher, whatever, Lacanian philosopher. Obviously, I'm not art theorist. I don't pretend to approach this in this way. I will approach it, Bacon, in my own particular way. And a very important part of this way will be looking at Bacon's theory, or if you want, philosophy. Namely, at these famous interviews that David Sylvester made with him over more than two or even 3 decades, from 62 to 86, which were published for the first time in 75. And then there were a subsequent edition with a couple, always I think, couple of new interviews added. And for me, this really was a kind of discovery, a kind of extremely fascinating thing to read. And I think it is of great importance also. It has a great philosophical interest. They have the interviews. It's not simply explaining his art. He thinks, the way he thinks art and thinks about what he is doing, it's extremely precise and articulated in ways that for me resonated in, and this is a kind of a surprising resonance probably with certain things from Hegel. And this will be my starting point, so kind of showing this or why do I think so, and then mostly focusing on Bacon, of course. Okay, so let me introduce this Hegelian aspect. As you know, of course, in his lectures on aesthetics, Hegel famously concluded that art has reached its end, or more precisely, that it is for us a thing of the past. This is the exact quote. He doesn't use the word end. And it is most interesting and perhaps also surprising to see to what extent Hegel's account of what this actually means, what he means by this, rhymes with Bacon's view of the situation in which, according to him, modern artists find themselves. And I will read to you a quote from the interviews. This is Bacon now. He says, "I think we are in a very curious position today, because when there is no tradition at all, there are 2 extreme ends. There is direct reporting, like something that's very near to a police report, and then there is only the attempt to make great art. And what is called the in-between art really in the time like ours does not exist." End of quote. Now, which for me was quite surprising and impressive is that Hegel uses almost the same terms when he describes how at the end of romantic art, which he also considers to be the culminating point of the movement in which art kind of frees itself from all prescriptions in regard to artistic content and form. That is, prescriptions springing from different traditions precisely, so art finally becomes free of all these prescriptions related to tradition. But at that precise moment, Hegel says art kind of falls apart or disintegrates into two extremes. So now a brief quote from Hegel. He says, "In the course of Romantic art, this opposition developed up to the point at which we had to arrive at an exclusive interest, either in contingent externality or in equally contingent subjectivity." Now, what does this mean? Hegel relates the former, that is this objective extreme in art, so to say, to the, as he puts it, imitation of external objectivity in all its contingent shapes. That is to meticulous kind of naturalist reproduction or recording and reporting, to use Bacon's vocabulary from the previous quote, of what is, let's say, out there. And Hegel relates the other extreme, this liberation of subjectivity in accordance to its inner contingency, to what he calls humor. But one has to point out that humor, the latter, does not refer for Hegel simply to something like hilarious jokes, but simply to the fact that what is primarily on display in this kind of art that he associates with humor in late Romanticism is not this or that object, but the wittiness, the spirit, the cleverness, the genius of the subject or artist herself. So, in other words, humor does not stand here for a, let's say, witty subject making jokes about various things, including herself, but whatever material that is being treated in this way, this material is not the subject matter or the content of this art. It is not what is on display in it. What is on display is actually the humor, the wittiness itself, claims Hegel. That is to say, precisely the subject. So it is, in this sense, it is subjective. The subject does not simply joke about things, the subject is the joke. And Hegel actually uses this quite ingenious expression, derivits des subjectes. He says, there is, again, a very short quote, the artist does therefore not produce a figure, Gestalt, but the subject makes itself seen or displays itself, das Subjekt gibt nur sich selbst zu sehen, and what shows itself are the feelings, sensations, the joke of the subject. So you see, we have, like here in Hegel, on the one hand, this kind of a willful disappearance of the subject in the attempt to do nothing but record things as realistically, naturalistically as possible, like one extreme of art, and on the other hand, we have what ultimately boils down to displaying the artistic genius itself, that is, to the sole attempt to make great art, to use Bacon's, what, as Bacon puts it, almost 150 years later. So you see that I think it's quite interesting how they put things almost in the literally same terms. Okay, so I started with this resonance, surprising echoing between Hegel and Bacon. Yet this echoing notwithstanding, we cannot, of course, ignore the fact that between Hegel and Bacon something did happen. And something that pushed, so to say, the Hegelian dissolution of art into two extremes over its edge, we could say. And Bacon relates this something to the discovery of photography. In a sense, photography, with its capacity to record and report precisely, closed off the objective extreme of art, like took it over eventually, and left only one way for art to continue, namely following precisely this subjective path. Hence Bacon's suggestion that contemporary art is all about the attempt to make great art. Now, just a brief note, I don't have time to go into it, but this, of course, does not mean that for Bacon, photography can be reduced to this, that photography is just about recording facts. It can be much more than this, and he actually uses this, as you probably know, very much in his own art. But there is just this point that there is a certain dimension of this reporting, which makes no sense in this way anymore, because photography kind of occupies this place, or can do it better, let's say. Okay, let's move on. So Bacon's dismissive views on abstract art are also, I guess, very well known. He's quite combative and critical and provocative in this confrontation. But again, what is perhaps less known or less emphasized is the properly kind of dialectical, even Hegelian way in which he formulates these views. And here is again a quote from the interviews. He says, "One of the reasons why I don't like abstract painting, or why it doesn't interest me, is that I think painting is a duality, and that abstract painting is an entirely aesthetic thing. It always remains on one level. It is only interested in the beauty of its patterns and its shape, or its shapes. We know that most people, especially artists, have large areas of an undisciplined emotion, and I think that abstract artists believe that in these marks that they are making, they are catching all these sorts of emotions. But I think that caught in that way, they are too weak to convey anything. I think that great art is deeply ordered." I think it's a kind of, I think it's a nice, interesting quote. So what is this duality that painting is for Bacon, and which accounts for the tension that makes it captivating, that makes it strong, according to him? It is the tension or the duality between precisely what he calls recording, or the illustrational thing, and something else, or more, or whatever. In this sense, for Bacon, the, let's say, traditional old painters were indeed lucky, because they were born into the world where they were expected to do the recording, this illustrational thing. They thought that they were recording, and of course they did something very much more than just recording. They, at least some of them, produced artistic masterpieces. Yet the kind of inevitability or necessity of recording was crucial, according to Bacon, also for traditional painters. Their artistic freedom and what they produced on top of the recording was kind of inseparable from the belief that they, or this imperative that they had to record things, or also illustrate in this particular sense. And so things no longer stand this way. As I said before, mechanical means of recording, starting with photography, have taken over, this is a quote from Bacon, the illustrational thing that painters in the past believed they had to do. And then Bacon kind of further speculates, it's a kind of a prosopopeia of how he thinks that abstract painters think. He says that abstract painters, realizing this, have thought, why not just go on in a free, fancy way, throw out all illustration and all forms of recording, and just give the effect of form and color. Okay, it goes without saying that this particular phrasing of what abstract painters thought is above all in the service of Bacon's particular argument that he's making. Contrasting, he wants to contrast precisely what he sees as this kind of a free, fancy play with something that he conceives as a deeper necessity and tension that gets lost in this move, if one simply kind of gives in here. So it is also clear, of course, that for Bacon, this deeper necessity and tension or duality cannot be simply regained by going back or ignoring precisely the historical break of modernism in all its aspects, including technological ones. It cannot be gained by saying, okay, let's continue to record things, and in this way the tension will perhaps reappear and will perhaps produce something more unexpected or captivating. Bacon's answer was different. It was to shift the very focus of recording without dismissing its imperative. This is how I would put it, and I will, even with paintings and with quotes, try to argue for this. And I think this is precisely what makes him so interesting. The imperative to record has changed. Recording is no longer about what artists are expected to do or what they think they have to do, even if they do something more or else. It is about, one could even formulate it in this way, about what they really have to do. And Bacon's word for this new type of necessity is obsession. He uses this word several times. Namely, being stuck with something in life, in reality, in others, that you absolutely want to record, yet still have to find a way of recording it, of doing it. Again, a quote from Bacon: abstract painting hasn't worked out because it seems the obsession with something in life that you want to record gives a much greater tension and a much greater excitement than when you've simply said you'll just go on in a free, fancy way and record the shapes and colors. You know, it's again the same kind of argument. There is certain obsession with something that you absolutely want to record. So this obsession is the key term here. Obsession with something you want to record, and not simply the recording itself, perhaps. You get stuck in wanting to record, make appear a singular thing that strikes you in something. This, at least, is the imperative or kind of drive that was there for Bacon when he painted. So, at the very extreme of subjectivity, like this obsession and stuckness with something are kind of subjective modes, there emerges a kind of a new and perhaps surprising dimension of object, this kind of absolute necessity or objectivation of doing it. So, I want to record an image is a phrase, a sentence that Bacon repeats at many points during these interviews. I want to record an image, which is a kind of a interesting thing to say for a modern painter. But what is this image? What is the status of this image, or appearance, as he also terms it, appearance? Obviously, it is not simply out there to be properly recorded. Things, or let's say people, appear all the time. I can record how people look or appear to me, but how can I record how they really appear? This is a kind of a phantom of this question that is there for Bacon. So this image, this particular image that he wants to record, I would say it's not a natural appearance. It can only be a made appearance. And again, this is his term. These are his terms. An artifice which renders that in reality which cannot be seen in a direct way, yet which we somehow immediately recognize as some crucial element or aspect of this reality and say, yes, that's it. Or in the case of a portrait, that's him or her. This is what kind of drives him, Bacon. So you see, there is a split right there. There is a split between, we could say, two kinds of images. There is image, okay, as resemblance, as illustration, and there is, we could say, an image that haunts me in the appearance of a person as something that I absolutely want to convey, record more clearly, more exactly, more violently, he says. it is something that we will be able to recognize immediately when we see it, but it's still kind of waiting to appear, properly speaking. It's not kind of there yet. Perhaps we could say that it is somehow like a ghost image. And the term ghost makes some sense in this context because there is a persistent lexis in Bacon's interviews which rhymes profoundly with the famous Hamletian dictum, the famous words that he utters apropos of the mousetrap, the device set up to make appear what Hamlet knows only from his father's ghost, precisely. He says, "The play is the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." So it's this mousetrap device or artifice that should make appear what this ghostly knowledge is. And the idea of setting a trap that will capture the real of some situation occurs again and again in Bacon, in interviews. This is really kind of, again, a recurring lexic. He says, for instance, it's really a question, in my case, of being able to set a trap with which one would be able to catch the fact at its most living point. Like an artifice which would bring in life in a more violent way than by simply immediately conveying or recording life. Or another very short quote, he says, "I think the difference from direct recording through the camera is that as an artist, you have to, in a sense, set a trap by which you hope to trap this living fact alive." So I think it's interesting that to think about this word, this the trap, and we'll come back to it also a little bit later. So this question of the trap is directly connected to two further questions. Obviously, the question of how to record an image by means other than illustration or mimetic depiction, as well as to a more general interrogation of the status of appearance as such. And I will start with this later a little bit, hope not too much in a digression-wise, but I think it's quite essential. This is all about, as I said before, making the appearance. Again, something that he repeats. Making the appearance, this is not meant in the sense of pretense or deceit, but literally of working it, making it like handwork, making the appearance. Work as process. And Bacon has this ingenious formulation. He says the mystery of painting today is how can appearance be made. It can be illustrated, it can be photographed, but how can this thing be made so that you catch the mystery of appearance within the mystery of making? It's a complicated quote, but I think it's quite ingenious. It's how do you catch the mystery of appearance within the mystery of making? So it is about making of appearance which means others than illustration, involving obviously also, this is his words, the whole questioning of what appearance is. So I think now, just to kind of break this speech a little bit, this quality of pure appearance is, for me at least, this is how I see it, particularly striking in paintings like the one we have here, where Bacon kind of produces it, this is how I see it, as a result of a kind of lack of depth, of anything behind the figure. Okay, one can see it, we were just talking about it before with Paul as a kind of decay, but if you look particularly on the picture on the extreme left, I think this kind of absence of that, I mean, it conveys for me this idea of appearance that kind of stands on its own, but nevertheless has a certain real. So this is the triptych from August 1972. And one could perhaps produce other examples, but I think it's an interesting way of, for me, it's kind of a reflection on what is appearance and how to make this mystery of appearance to appear in the very mystery of creating. Again, perhaps surprisingly, this idea of appearance and this insistence resonates strongly with what Hegel situates, with the way Hegel situates what painting is all about throughout his lectures on aesthetics, namely Schein und Scheinen, usually translated in English as pure appearance and also showing sometimes. So for pages and pages, Hegel insists on how painting is all about creating a pure appearance and not about the appearance of this or that thing. And he means this kind of appreciatively, obviously. He says, for instance, very short quote, painting must press on to the extreme of pure appearance, that is to say, to the point where the content does not matter and where the chief interest is the artistic creation of that appearance. You see, it's, again, for me, this resonates a lot with how Bacon puts it. And for Hegel, Schein is precisely a made appearance, made in the same sense that I was referring to before, and also what he calls an ensouled appearance, which is a most interesting notion, I think. And Hegel explicitly states that what is at stake here is not the conformity of the painting with its object, like the object that it represents, but he says to show the correspondence of the portrait object with itself, of the painterly object with itself. So that this is what is at stake. And this is said to be reality ensouled for itself. So, incidentally, but I don't think accidentally, Bacon, for his part, likes to speak about an image that lives on its own, that has a life of its own. And I think this is very much his version of an ensouled appearance, precisely. It relates directly to also to another aspect of that. I will not go into this Hegelian notion of objective humor. But anyway, so the crucial point here in this Hegelian idea is the idea that what is at stake is the kind of correspondence or not of the portrait object, painterly object with itself. And I think that this idea can actually take us very far in understanding how Bacon does and thinks art. Namely, art for him is not about how a painter is affected by different objects simply, or how she sees them and so on. It is also not about making an appearance of this real object. It is about making, you could say, creating precisely an appearance as object of how these objects relate to themselves. In this precise sense, it is in this precise sense that appearance is ensouled or has a life of its own. So again, to cut this a little bit with appearances, with pictures, I think this could be a way of seeing or understanding Bacon's propensity for series. You know, there is this. There are all these paintings that begin with titles like 3 studies, particularly triptychs, but there are 3 studies or simply a series of paintings. So there is this tendency to paint series of paintings. And I think this can be related to what I just said about this logic of appearance and the painterly object relating to itself and creating the real of its of what it is about precisely within this movement. So this is one example, and I will then explain more what I think about it very briefly, but still 3 studies for portrait of Henrietta Moraes. This is from '63. Then I have another one from a later period, which is 3 studies for self-portrait, yeah, which again has this, for me, this kind of a aspect of appearance. What exactly is appearance? What is pure appearance that I was referring to before? So it's kind of good example of both. So these paintings or these appearances do not tell a story. Bacon is very much insisting on this when he talks about precisely, he's asked about why he paints this, why series, why there are several paintings. It's not about telling a story, but what does this mean? I think it means that we are not dealing with kind of a temporal sequence and with narrating some segment of reality, but precisely with the constellation where one picture reflects on the other continuously, and this is from Bacon. Why one picture reflects on the other continuously. So figures in the series do not exactly, we could say, relate to each other. They are in a sense the same painterly object which relates to itself through this serial structure. So it's not that between them there is this kind of it's like one split in 3 which moves or split or whatever in 3 forms that which kind of moves around and produces a certain movement within itself. And it is only through this relation, relates to itself through this serial structure, that the painterly object actually becomes what it is, or appears. It only appears, is created in this very process. So this serial or tripartite structure is one of the ways, I think, in which painterly objects relate to themselves, and in doing this, kind of trap and convey the real they want to record. There is a kind of construction going on with the seriality as a way for some real to kind of return to its place or find its place in it. Okay, and this consideration will now lead us to measure, and this I am now moving to the concluding part, not immediately concluding, but the second last part, to measure not only the proximity but also the distance between Hegel and Bacon. Obviously, as I already said before, there is something like a historical eventuality of which Hegel could not have any idea, and I think it would be very non-Hegelian to claim otherwise. So I'm not simply saying Bacon is all there in Hegel, or this is simply the same thing. There is something which, in fact, does, I think, separate them, although it's still illuminating to think about this precisely through Hegel, like pushing this Hegelian edifice kind of over its edge. So Bacon's art, as well as his reflections on art, force us to distinguish between 2 things which are often taken together or confused, I think. One is the question of resemblance, of recognition, of recalling, of recording, and the second is the question of illustration or illustrative and non-illustrative form. And as I've already tried to emphasize, the question of resemblance, recognition, recalling, recording remains absolutely valid, even imperative for Bacon. One doesn't just go and display one's feelings on the canvas. One doesn't present the onlooker with kind of a soup of feelings and sensations that the latter can enter and be captivated by. I have an interesting quote here, but perhaps we can come back to this in the discussion. Painting is an artifice, a deeply ordered and disciplined form that works on feelings, but not simply with feelings. A form for Bacon that unlocks, as he puts it, different layers of sensation. And abstract expressionism is, on the other side, for Bacon as a kind of running subjective commentary, an exposition of how things make us feel. This is how he kind of perceived it, recordings of our sensation. Whereas he is in search of a form that, or a figure that could unlock simultaneously different layers of sensation, be more kind of violent in this sense, also more combative. One aims here at some sort of recognition, at producing the effect of, yes, that's it, with the kind of paintings, but this recognition is not based on what we would call illustration as kind of point-by-point correspondence. It can come from an image that looks very much distorted. For instance, Bacon says, what I want to do is to distort the thing far beyond the appearance, but in the distortion to bring it back to a recording of the appearance. Now, there's this kind of movement. In relation to this last quote, I think the first thing perhaps not to do is to take this distortion, which is obviously very much present in Bacon, to take this distortion itself as an illustration or as a metaphor of, say, the distorted world that we live in. And actually, after the end of the war, Bacon first exhibited the probably most famous 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion from 1944. This interpretation is precisely what happened. It also, to some extent, what made him famous. Namely, the deformity was kind of generally seen, perceived as, in a way, reflecting the horrors of the war. This kind of, and Bacon was very much opposed to this reading, and I think very rightly so. Because what he was after here went, I think, much deeper than this kind of psychology. The world was shattered in its foundation, and the question is not, and cannot be, how do we feel about it, but rather, how does this affect our way, our capacity even of feeling and perception itself in its own ontological core? How does this affect the way we can recognize, recall things at all? So something has changed in the very mode in which the world or spirit or life appears to itself, or can appear to itself, or just simply appear. Something has changed in the world's mode of relation to itself. So this is why the painter, as part of this relation, has obviously to change her way of doing art. But this is not simply about choosing more macabre objects and motives like the one that, abandoned in Bacon, like crucifixion, meat, screams, and so on. But it's also about the way in which objects now relate to themselves, correspond to themselves, across a violent interruption of all immediacy precisely in this relation. And I think this is the violent point. It's not, and he also kind of exists, he doesn't want to accept this idea that David Sylvester also kind of suggests, that his paintings are like there is this horror, there is this violence, and so on. He really doesn't want to go there and kind of endorse this. It's not there that the violence is situated in, like, the motives, painting the flesh, the meat, and so on. For him, this is beautiful. It's not horrible. But again, and I will try to explain this, what I mean by this violent interruption. Okay, so I said that what happens is now that the objects, they can only relate to themselves or correspond to themselves, as I said before, this painterly object, across this violent interruption of all immediacy immediacy in this relation. And for me, for instance, an example of this, of how this is part of the way he makes his art, is Bacon's insistence that he prefers to make portraits based on photographies of his models. People whom he knew otherwise, but when he painted them, their portraits, he preferred to do it from their photographies rather than to have these models like posing directly. And the way he explains this is, he says the only thing that can bring about the real recognition is an artifice. Now, that is to say, an image with absolutely no immediate, like direct or organic, whatever, links with the model. Whereas, this is the quote, the real model before you, in my case, inhibits the artificiality by which this thing can be brought back or recollected. So, in other words, you see that there is this interesting paradox that actually interacting with a live person, with this live sitting for you, kind of inhibits the artifice which can bring real life into the image. So their life is here on two different levels, and he goes for this other kind of interrupted way where also, as we will see, this idea of the trap comes in. Okay, so Bacon's stand against illustration is so much part of the, I think, predominant way in which modern art thinks itself or about itself, that we risk missing Bacon's exceptionality here, namely precisely the fact that for Bacon this stand against illustration is absolutely bound up with the seemingly contrary imperative of recording, recognition, of recording of an image, of the coincidence or correspondence of the painterly object with itself. So this imperative is something that he will never give up, because it is the very generator of the tension that for him makes the art interesting and powerful. So the fundamental opposition or difference here is for him between illustrative and non-illustrative form. This is where now things get also very interesting conceptually. And this in turn relates to what Bacon calls a logical outcome and an illogical way of getting to it in the process in which he works. He wants to do a portrait of a person, but not by copying her trait. He has to do it, yet he also has to do it in a completely illogical way, that is, without there being any kind of direct continuity between this person or this object and the appearance. And the whole question becomes how. I know what I want to do, but I don't know how to bring it about. He keeps repeating. Again, this is one of the phrases that keeps returning. And the whole working process is about that. And this, the infamous chance that he talks about, and that I will now focus on a little bit, like simply throwing paint at the picture, hoping for some accidental way of finding out how to do it, enters precisely here. So sometimes when he throws paint, an accidental mark appears that renders perfectly or shows him a way to go about it, what he wants to record. He kind of recognizes without this coming from a kind of illustrative, descriptive activity. And when this happens, the effect must be, he says, that of inevitability, not simply of some free fancy freedom. So again, we have this seemingly contradictionally mode in which he proceeds. In other words, the idea would be this: you are obsessed with something, you want to record, you paint and throw paint, not working by means of illustration. You work in a totally illogical way, but when you succeed, the thing is, quote, totally real, and in the case of a portrait, totally recognizable as the person. So it's this kind of... So the only way to the logical outcome is the illogical way of going about it. Otherwise, logic itself, or the relating of the object to itself, is kind of lost in translation. It is lost in illustration, in copying, loses its vigor and becomes something else, more or less anecdotic. Okay, what exactly is going on here? This would be my kind of last question, and I will try to make some sense of it. Why this insistence on resemblance that is not brought about by an effort to create resemblance, but by means of illogical, non-voluntary, non-representational marks? Actually, marks that he, for instance, recognizes already in Rembrandt. He says that the way Rembrandt portraits, like eye sockets and stuff, it's precisely not that you can see marks that are there precisely in this way, not in an illustrational way. This is why Rembrandt is one of his kind of big idols. So what does one gain by not doing it logically? There are two answers, I think, or better, two steps in answering this question. First, the result, the image, is much more powerful in this way. Bacon is convinced of it. And one can see the difference, actually. If this succeeds and it works like this, it kind of gets to you on another level than through this kind of more representative, illustrational way. And the other step or part of the answer is simply one cannot do it the old way any longer, not simply because photography and other available means of technical reproduction have cut off this path for art, but because, more importantly, the illogical proceeding marks precisely an interruption, a discontinuity, a gap that is essential. I think this is how I read Bacon here, that it's essential to the new logic of appearance as such, precisely understood as the coincidence in the very difference of the object appearance with itself. And of course, this coincidence is far from obvious or necessary. So I think it is here, at this point, that the whole idea, which is so central for Bacon, of the accident. You know that he was also a passionate gambler. The moment he sold a picture, he went, I don't know, to Monte Carlo and kind of gambled. So the question of chance is very important for him also in this level, and what he called a guided chance. Again, a short quote: I want a very ordered image, but I want it to come about by chance. The same kind of contradiction. So, or the ideal, says Bacon, would really be just to pick up a handful of paint and throw it at the canvas and hope that the portrait was there. This is, and I think we can have from this quote this idea of a kind of a radical discontinuity, precisely, or severance of all kind of organic links at the very core of your object in its ontological constitution as appearance. Throw something and the appearance is there. Yet by saying that this would be his ideal, I don't think that Bacon has in mind a kind of unattainable ideal, but rather something like perhaps his version of the end of art, namely this would be the painting to put an end to painting as art. Because what art as practice consists of, according to Bacon, is precisely the work, the dedication, the passion that makes this happen, that brings about this the coincidence from the very discontinuity, the work that brings about the coincidence of the object with itself from within this discontinuity, or as a form of this very discontinuity. If this work were no longer necessary, then we could say perhaps there would be no room or need for art. So chance, this accident, only becomes chance, and this is important for Bacon, when you spot it and seize it. That is, when you're able to see in the strange thing that just happened when you did something, just happened out there, when you recognize a surprising match with what you want to record, or a surprising way in which that shows you how to do what you want to do, yet didn't know how. Now you have a way, at least an indication of it, and the work of and the art proper only, we could say, begins when something like this happens. And, quote again, it has to do with using your critical faculty where you suddenly see an opening. So there is this idea of there is a certain opening, something happens here, you use your need your critical faculty to recognize it, because obviously Daniel Sylvestre asks him at some point, okay, if your whatever cleaning lady would just throw paint, would this be the same thing? I mean, yes and no. I think for him it's not, he's not, and I will insist on this, he's not just saying, this is not about throwing paint and seeing what happens and then preserving, let's say, aesthetically interesting results. It's not at all about this. Bacon doesn't want to his images even to look like thrown paint. He is quite explicit on this point. He wants them to look inevitable and kind of bring on precisely this idea, this obsession, this something that he wants to record. So this is not, with all this insistence on or important role of the accident, of the chance in his discourse on this, it is not about glorifying simply the accident as, say, the spontaneous or the unconscious or whatever. It is about a very disciplined selection which only works with things or accidents that enable him to record the image he wants to record. It is not about preserving, displaying the accident, but more about kind of using it, putting it in the service of some necessity, of some obsession, like a way out, precisely like an opening to what one wants to record. And I think this is what he calls chance in this strong sense, or guided chance, which is again this kind of paradoxical notion. It has a lot to do with luck, obviously, with something that happens, something that unexpectedly and quite literally enters the picture. But it has at least as much to do with the ability to recognize what happened there. Which is not simply, this is part of the artistic work, to recognize what happened there and that it did happen. Wanting it to happen and being able to also discard the rest. As you probably know, Bacon was quite famous for allegedly throwing away, destroying a lot of good pictures, even ones they've already sold very well. So it was, he had this tendency to say this went too far, so he would immediately destroy it. So it is about recognizing the right accident, using that accident, working in a most disciplined way to do with its help what you want to do. It is also a way, one could say, of making something substantial emerge out of this contingency, which is basically at stake here. So you throw paint or other stuff and something happens, you use it to work your way back to the appearance you want to make, to the appearance in this sense that I defined before, to the image or object you kind of want to record. So again, this going out, like throwing out and then working your way back, is a kind of a deeply Hegelian move, yet I would say radicalized here by an element of, we could say, pure discontinuity. In Hegel, it seems, at least according to predominant critical accounts of him, we in Ljubljana have some different ideas about this, but nevertheless the predominant critical account of Hegel is that the spirit goes out of itself, alienates from itself and loses itself in the other, only then to come back to itself as if logically and necessarily from within this experience of loss. This is a kind of dialectical move, which, yeah, it's there in Hegel. And I would say that what is different now in Bacon, or what he kind of wants to enforce with how he does things, is that there is absolutely no necessity, no logic anymore, no guarantee that the spirit will find itself again. It can simply stay out of itself, wandering indefinitely in this ghostly form, in the form of a ghost image. I think Bacon's implicit thesis is that it can only happen that it finds itself again. It is a question of chance, precisely, and of art, which is this kind of guided chance. And we could perhaps say, again, using this Bacon's opposition that he likes to use, differently from abstract expressionism, which contents itself with recording these ecstatic forms of the spirit. It's falling out of itself and kind of erring around in its ghostly form. Bacon kind of wants to bring it back to itself. He wants for it to find its figure, we could say. And with it, of course, the very itself to which it has to return. This itself, it's not simply somewhere in hiding, but has to be actually invented, created in this very movement. We could say the point is precisely to create in the appearance itself the thing that this appearance resembles, recalls, but which is not simply, it has a certain dimension of the real. So when he speaks, and I'm really very close now to concluding, when he speaks of the appearance, of how this mystery of painting is, how can appearance be made, I think we could say he speaks precisely of the figure of the famous Bacon's figure. And here I would go perhaps a little bit against the very, very interesting and productive reading that, for instance, Deleuze has of Bacon. I think there is nothing which is basically that he makes the figure explode precisely by figure, that he uses figure in order to explode the figure, which I think it's the most Hegelian formulation one can find. Deleuze is sometimes much more directly Hegelian than he would like to be, but I propose a slightly different reading here. I think there is, first of all, there is nothing obvious, let alone easy, in proposing a figure today. Because if a word has no figure, and uncountable images of people, objects, landscapes, whatever that we are sunk into thanks to whatever visual media and so on, they are not really figures in this strong Baconian sense. They most often recall nothing real or rarely. So that perhaps we could say that figuration also in the classical, the strong but also classical painterly sense of the term does not really need to get exploded, it already has exploded. And the effort is rather the opposite. It is a kind of a task to make a figure, to bring about a genuine figure. And I think this is this interesting tension that Bacon talks about and which kind of drives his work. And particularly in his early work, it is often quite striking how we have this, at least this is just a way of seeing this, but how figures literally kind of strive to appear, to form themselves out of what is often a very dense net of abstract patterns. And I have like three, it obviously cannot be reduced to this, but I have like three, I think, very direct examples of this. This one is a study for portrait from 49. This is the famous study after Velázquez from 1950. and again study after Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X. It's 53. So you see this kind of a tension, if you want, or struggle at work here, and the stake of the figure and the whole reflection of what is within it. So we could say, and now this is really the end, there is a fundamental discontinuity, but there remains a tension. And at stake is the inscription, I would say, for Bacon, of this radical discontinuity and not simply explosion of all continuity. Because it's a different logic if you and the discontinuity is here in the very tension and because of it. Or we could say discontinuity appears all the more violently because there is a coming back, a recalling, a creation of recognizable appearance. Discontinuity is there because something is returning to its place, and discontinuity is observable precisely at the moment something returns to its place, and not simply perhaps while it's kind of wandering around. So in this sense, recognition, I think, itself is a surprise, or rather it is the surprise. What is surprising is that we recognize something at all. Okay, I think this is precisely in this sense that Bacon will say, with humor, okay, I will finish with something that sounds like a joke, but I think it's not. He will say with humor, but also quite sincerely, I'm always surprised when I wake up in the morning. You know, even what is most obvious, there is this element of discontinuity at work in it, and the surprise that accompanies it. Okay, this is it basically. Thank you very much. Yes, I think I can take a couple, but then I will kind of collapse. It's been a long day effort.
I was really interested in the way you characterized these last paintings as sort of...
Sorry, can you speak a little bit more?
Yes, I can. As the figure sort of being a birth out of this surrounding abstraction, I wonder if we could return to the first image you showed.
The very first?
The very first.
Okay, no.
I think it might be doing something a little bit different. It strikes me as a very witty series of images, particularly in its differentiation of planes. Because particularly on the left and the right, it looks like the figure is sort of posed in a traditional kind of posture for portrait photography. And I think that's emphasized by the black canvas, what could be construed as a black canvas behind him, or maybe something like a photograph. But then the sort of spill of blood or paint is on a different plane that sort of resembles the plane of abstract expressionism. Helen Frankenthaler's portrait paintings, or even Jackson Pollock's strip paintings. And it seems like it's sort of a witty separation of this idea of illustration versus abstraction. But that abstraction, the sort of paint and the blood, is coming out of the figure. And that maybe the moment of capture of the figure is actually sort of the moment that the mechanism of painting or of this artistic dialectic that you're constructing is sort of revealed in painting itself, so that the capture of the figure is the birth of process. And I wonder if maybe these images are actually sort of doing the philosophical legwork, maybe even more poignantly than he constructs in his interviews. Or that he
no, this is a very ingenious remark. No, I very much. I think it's an excellent way of formulating what is going on. And also, there is at some point in the interviews when he speaks precisely of how obviously he does use the abstraction in a certain way. It's not that he wants. I mean, he uses it in a way that brings something else out. I mean, just what you, as you said. So I think it's also, obviously, I mean, I think if one would have to decide, probably one could say that he was a even better painter, that he was a philosopher or theorist. But so I'm absolutely convinced that there are ways, I mean, I don't know, I really started to work with the words, with the interview to kind of even find a way of also perhaps an artifice to look to the pictures in a way that would not be some kind of attempt at direct commentary. But I think for somebody who is, as I guess perhaps probably you are, much more trained in this, I think this is I mean, obviously the paintings, the pictures themselves are a reflection precisely. I mean, this thought process is built into them, and it's and this is also what makes it so powerful. I think yeah.
Thanks. That was very interesting. I have two questions or two suggestions for contrast, and wanted to ask you if you could maybe think about them or say something about them. And I think both are directed at maybe hearing some more about the role that the real has in the paintings, or your understanding of what Bacon does. And let's use two contrasts. So I very much like the description that you gave of the series in Bacon. So the way in which the picture articulates itself is a continuous reflection upon itself. So one way of thinking about this could be that somehow art is very self-referential here. It just returns on itself. Pure appearance. It's not about the thing anymore depicted, but just it circles around itself. If we describe it like that, it seems to look similar to other understandings of modernism, where art just returns to its own meaning. But it seems to be something else that's going on. And I would be interested to hear some more about this relation that this type of self-reference has, maybe to the real. And another suggestion in the same direction. So you were describing the role that chance has, and also the kind of inevitability of the product. Now, if we could relate this to a certain kind of understanding that we find in Kant, and that Hegel also adopts in a certain manner. So the artwork appears as natural. And then Hegel adds that it's important that it's not just appears as natural, but it's made natural. So that's the great thing about it, about the artwork. But still there's a certain sense in which it's a kind of a traditional requirement that the product of art should have a natural appearance, should be some sort of a second nature. But now it seems to me that the kind of chance and inevitability that you're tracing there is something else. So it's not just a product of spirit that appears natural again, that doesn't strike us, but another form of inevitability. And so my sense is, again, that's something that could be explained in terms of the real. So yeah, two suggestions about kind of contrasting cases that might help us to narrow this down.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope I will be, I'm still focused enough to answer this question, because it's absolutely crucial, and I brought in this term of the real, which I'm kind of working with and on much more in detail in the seminar, which is the real that is not simply equivalent or synonymous with reality, or like the object in this kind of immediate everyday sense of the word. And I think that to some extent we can say for all art, not only modern art, that it actually has, whenever it is kind of strong and real art, that it has this kind of a dimension of the real which is not reducible to the simple what is it makes art art. It is not the resemblance with whatever even in the kind of traditional art. It is always the je ne sais quoi, something more than reveals precisely this reality in a way that is new, and that makes it possible for a subject to conceive this as a kind of a new object. So there is a certain objective dimension which is not reducible to reflection of the objectivity there, but which emerges with the very subjective take on this particular reality, but which is nevertheless, and so then it's the whole question of the real and of what art, what is that we recognize. And there is obviously this Kantian questioning there. How does it happen that even though we have no firm a priori criteria about what is art, how to make art, we nevertheless recognize it when when we see it. So it's not, it's as he put it, universality without a concept. It's not that we have a pre-established concept and we apply it and we see, okay, that it did. It's kind of, we only from each work of art we learn what the art, what is the object. This, I think, is the real, the dimension of the real that I'm talking about, or at least one part of it. Another way of putting it would be, as you rightly remarked, this relating of the question of the series and relating of the paintings among themselves, or it's not about self-referentiality. It's not simply about this kind of claustrophobic, so it's just reflecting upon itself. It is precisely about a certain things can only relate to themselves across precisely a certain discontinuity, and this discontinuity itself kind of appears as an object or something as something real in the very painting. So they are different. I mean, I'm not saying that there is one way in which to describe or define this real, but basically for me, real or is precisely something about the situation which is not simply or directly visible in it, but which nevertheless kind of not really explains it, but what kind of gives us the explains it in the sense that we kind of know what the coordinates of it are. And this is why I like this sorry, I'm kind of image or of the mousetrap from Hamlet, because here you have this good image of a real which can never be directly, this is what I think interesting. Real is not something, some hidden reality that needs to be revealed. It is only something that could be constructed. This is why it's only possible to be there via redoubling of fiction. You know, there is this mouse, it's a play within the play, which will catch the real. It's not that simply it was hush-hushed, it was hidden, but it's precisely the very thing at the core of how the kingdom of Denmark functions there is about this crime. But it's not that we can simply say, oh, let's see who done it and that's it. There is the only way, okay, this is what I want to say, the only way not simply to reveal or this real, but to inscribe it in the very reality of which it is the real, is by redoubling of fiction, by artifice. And I think this is very much what is going on here in Bacon. At least this is how I see it. Yeah, sorry, it took me some time to gather my thoughts. I think I can take one more question, but then I'm not sure.
I think it's me. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I don't know if this is a comment or a question, but the discussion of Bacon's figure, which is beyond the sum of its appearances, I keep trying to figure out where I've heard this before. At first I thought it was Heidegger, that art's a truth process which is not reducible to either empirical inventories or subjective gushing. And then I thought, no, it's André Bazin and the ontology of the photographic image, in which a true realism would not be reducible to appearance, it'd be something else. And then I thought, no, some people joke that title, that paper from 1945 should be called the oncology of the photographic image because of radiation. And then I realized that, I mean, what I think this is about X-rays and anatomical images, which, as you know, Bacon was deeply fascinated with. And I mean, the problem with anatomical images, a photograph is usually lousy. You're not going to illustrate a medical textbook with a photograph because you can't see the structure. And an X-ray image is not going to be particularly clear. You need to have some kind of expert knowledge to figure out what's going on. So I don't know if this is a comment or question, but I'm just, do you think that the anatomical image or that the X-ray radiograph is an example of the kind of Baconian figure?
No, I think it's a very good question and comment at the same time. I think it's absolutely the right question to ask. And I think there is something to it. I don't have, I would have to think about it, but it rings real or true when you say that is the way that he used this and also some other. One is the X-rays, and the other is, which is I think related perhaps also to this thing that we were just discussing before the series. It's the photographies of movement, which kind of really breaks down the movement into this, which is, I guess, definitely, related to what I was trying to kind of formulate or say here,
Why don't we thank you for your talk and
Thank you. Yeah.